I'm going to share with you something a little bit different than the usual lectures you guys get. So let me tell you a little bit about my background so everybody's kind of on the same page as to what I do. I work at Kaiser Permanente. My role is to basically frame and create all of the nutrition programs that we serve for our 4.6 million members. So that's my job. So part of that requires me to read every single study that I can get my hands on around nutrition. So our stance in Southern California nutrition, as far as that's concerned, was based on reviewing over 2,000 nutrition studies. So basically, I had to sit in a dark hole and read and read and read till I lost all my hair. So the one thing I have to warn you that plant-based diets can't do is regrow this. I don't care what anybody says, I'm living proof. No. So anyway, so that's sort of my job. And so what I do is every single month I actually put on a nutrition webinar for all of Southern California Kaiser Permanente physicians and staff. And now it's become a national thing. So what you're going to get to see tonight was, I offered a list of topics, and I wanted to see what you guys were interested in. And these were the two topics that I heard you guys were interested in. But just so you know, my only disclosure that I want to give you right away is I run a nonprofit organization called Self Principle. It stands for Sleep, Exercise, Love, and Food. So self. And the reason I did that was because when I started doing all this research, what came to me over and over again was this concept that the longest living people in the world were doing certain things repeatedly without even thinking about it. They were sleeping more, they were moving more. What they were doing was creating social networks, social engagement. They actually made sure that a simple thing like saying hello, caring about somebody, giving somebody a hug, making sure somebody's okay, those things mattered. They meditated, they practiced mindfulness, and they ate mostly plants. So when we look at a plant-based diet, what I want you to remember is it's a spectrum. The more you move down that spectrum, the better you're going to be. And there's no harm and there's no mistakes of sometimes falling down. If you fall down, it's okay, get up and do it again. So let me share with you some of the data around sleep that I think is really relevant to you guys. And then let me share some data around artificial sweeteners that I think you're going to find kind of interesting. And then after that, you can ask me questions about these topics or pretty much any topic you want, because at the end of the day, my job is literally to sit there and read and read and read. So there are thousands of studies that are trapped in this head just waiting to come out. So there's no question that's off limits as far as I'm concerned. So with that, let's get started. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about is everybody knows you should sleep more, except for a few people who think that they're so brave that they only sleep 2 hours a night or 4 hours a night, and they say it's a badge of honor that I only sleep so little. Well, here's the problem. The problem is that those people who sleep so little are setting themselves up for something very significant in the future. Let's see a little bit how it works. So there was a really interesting study. This one came up pretty recently over here. And what I want to share with you about this study is what makes this so significant to you guys. And if you have children at home, especially teenagers, this is really going to apply. In fact, I'm not a political person. The only time I get into politics is when it's politically about food. But what I want you guys to understand, one of the new laws in California that just got passed, that I'm a big, big, big proponent of, is changing the times for when schools start for children. It is a huge thing. And for people like me, whose job it is to look at the data, if you were reading the data, you would say, wow. What an incredible historic moment that we have where we're finally going to do something to actually protect our children. And why is it so important? That's what this study is about. So what is beta amyloid and why should you care and what's its impact and what the heck does it have to do with sleep? So remember, doctors, just like lawyers, just like engineers, in order for us to feel important, we take a very simple word and make it into something really, really complicated. Right? So beta amyloid sounds really sophisticated and it makes me have like a $20 word, but it's really simple. So essentially all it is just a waste product. I'm going to throw a bunch of words on there that you don't need to worry about, so don't worry if you don't understand some of the lingo in there. And if there's a typo, don't tell me. It'll just make me feel bad, right? So I'll just pretend like there's a sophisticated way of saying that word. That's all it was. So the reason it becomes so important as far as beta amyloid goes is because your body, specifically your brain, is constantly producing it. And it gets rid of it. But what's fascinating about that is if you get too much of this stuff, somehow, we don't know if it's directly causing it, or if it's an intermediary, which means it's in the middle somewhere, or it's just something that you can see even though it's not involved in the pathway. But we know that when you look at diseases like Alzheimer's, you know that there's higher amounts of beta amyloid found inside the brain. So what do we know about beta amyloid? How does it leave the brain? Right? This is the most important question that everybody wants to know. And the answer is, I have no idea. I don't know how it leaves the brain. So because we don't know how it leaves the brain, a lot of this stuff is still misunderstood. That's why there's been so many drug trials regarding Alzheimer's disease, and they've gotten into later stages and they've all failed. We're still waiting on something that can help us when it comes to Alzheimer's treatment. Here, we're talking about prevention, right? An ounce of prevention better than a pound of cure. So, what's interesting about all of this stuff is that starting from animal models, if you restrict animals into not being able to sleep, the amount of beta amyloid in their brains goes up very significantly. If you do the same thing to humans, which by the way, it's very easy to get human volunteers to do this, you can also see that the levels of beta amyloid go up very, very quickly. All right, now, why should you care? Because the places in the brain that beta amyloid goes into are the places that you all care about the most. That's your memories. So the part, that lack of sleep, which causes this beta amyloid to accumulate, which goes and affects the most important part of what makes you, you. You are made from all your experiences. And if something or someone is taking that away from you, that would have a substantial impact on you. So in this particular study, and just so you guys understand, the reason that guys like me, we always look and analyze all of these studies is because there's too many people who say a study showed that you're going to gain 200% benefit from this way. Then there's another study that says you're going to lose 200% benefit this way. And the general public gets confused. How come one study showed this and the other one showed this? And there's a very good reason why. So for example, I'll sidetrack for a second. There's a study called the PURE trial. Anybody heard of the PURE trial? Yeah, there's some people in the audience who have, right? And what it basically came out and said was, guess what? Saturated fat is good for you. And everybody was confused and they said, wait a second, is saturated fat good or bad? Because previous data had shown it was bad. This one shows it's good. We have no clue. But here's what was important. For the people who analyzed the study, what they found was, on the one hand, they took fat, they broke it up into polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated. So the polys and monos are good for you, and the saturated fat is bad for you. Yet, when they compared it to carbohydrates, they did not break down carbohydrates. So carbohydrates come in different varieties. For example, potato chips is a carbohydrate, and it's all junk, right? You eat potato chips, and it's not so good for you. Yet at the same time, sweet potatoes are awesome for you. But when they looked at the countries that they were comparing this to, those countries had per capita incomes that were really low. And when you make so little money, the most calorie-rich food you can get is the fried, buttery, simple sugars, because it fills you up really, really fast. So all the PURE trials showed was not that saturated fat is bad, but that being poor is a risk factor for death. Wow, what a different statement than the original statement that the authors are talking about. Just like this year, there's a study out just recently, in a matter of weeks, where they talked about how meat is not bad for you. And so now everybody's confused. They're like, wait a second, we got this really respectable journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine, publishing a study that says meat is not bad for you. So should I just go back and start eating meat? And am I going to live longer? Well, once again, if you look at the data, red meat has something interesting, right? So red meat is a rich source of carnitine. But what's fascinating about the studies on this is if you're somebody who eats red meat regularly, you change your gut bacteria. And the way you change it is when red meat goes inside your stomach, into your intestines, it forms something known as trimethylamine. Once again, $50 word to make me look smart. Trimethylamine gets converted into trimethylamine oxide, or TMAO. TMAO goes inside your blood and does something very fascinating. It blocks cholesterol from leaving your blood, and it increases cholesterol from your liver coming into your blood. What's the bottom line? It takes these cells called macrophages, fills them up with cholesterol, and they go and line all of your blood vessels. As a result, you get beautiful plaques. So when I talk about data, it's so important to read the study and understand the specifics and not just say the conclusion. Because the conclusion that it says in the paper may actually not be the right conclusion. So in this fact, what they wanted to do was they wanted to look at what happens if we take young people. Why take young people in a study like this? Because if we took people who are a little bit wiser, what would happen is that they may have already had a lot of exposures. So it's really hard to tell that if they saw something with the beta amyloid, is it because they had those exposures? Or is it truly because of a lack of sleep? So therefore, they picked healthy people, 10 males, 10 females. Average age was about 40 years old, give or take a little bit, right? And so what they wanted to do was, how do we tell if the beta amyloid is leaving the body, leaving the brain? Very simple. You basically attach a tag to it. That tag kind of like glows in the dark, so it makes it very easy for you to trace how fast it's leaving the brain. That's it. It's a very simple model. We do that in human studies. We do that in animal studies. It's very simple. It's just a simple injection. Okay, so now that you understand the study, what did they find? Basically, what they found was that the areas of the brain where the beta amyloid was accumulating are the most important areas that you want to protect. That's where your memories are. All those red spots over there, or if you call it orange, that's okay. I see orange here, I see red over there. But whatever you call it, those are the places of the brain you want to try to protect. And then what was really interesting was that a single night, one night of not sleeping, basically increased your beta amyloid by as much as 5%. That's a single night of you not getting adequate sleep. Now, anytime you look at a study, you always want to be aware that there's going to be limitations to the study. So before we look at limitations, there's a few points that you want to understand. A single night of not sleeping had some very, very interesting effects. A couple of things, right? First, of course, you're going to be less alert. It's kind of like being drunk, right? And the impact of that is very real, especially if you have young kids who stay up all night and then they're running around driving. They were more tired. They also felt like they were less friendly. They were just grumpy. Now, my wife might say, I'm grumpy, but hey, I'm a saint. I don't know what she's saying. And it has nothing to do with a lack of sleep. They were less happy. They were less social. They were more confused. They were less energetic. And of course, they had difficulty staying awake. But the reason you should care is because it's a single night. A single night caused buildup of this beta amyloid. Now think about your own life and think about how many nights have you not slept the optimal amount of hours. And I'm going to tell you what the optimal amount of hours are. So you've heard all sorts of data about how much you ought to sleep. But let's give you the scientific evidence for what you really ought to be doing tonight. So here's the evidence. Basically, what they were showing in these guys was that if you saw these guys sleeping, the optimal number of hours that you wanted was greater than 8. Official guidelines, 7 to 9 hours. What's your take-home message tonight? You really ought to aim for more than 8 hours of sleep every night. Now, for those of you who don't sleep, we're going to talk a little bit about how to help you sleep better. But before we do that, just the things to know about studies. Whenever you look at studies, look at how many people they look at. Because if they do a study like this where they have to inject people, you're not going to see 1 million, 2 million people being tested. But if it's a population-based study, you want to see 1 million, 2 million people, and you want to see how many millions of person years of data they collected. So you're looking for really large numbers. Number 2 is you want to look at which groups did they study. For example, if they only studied bald people, right? Then everybody in here, it doesn't apply to all of you. I would be the odd person out. So you want to know which ethnic groups they studied because it may not necessarily apply to the rest of the people. You also want to know is what happens in, for example, in this study is, what happens if you try to catch up on sleep? Does that somehow make the beta amyloid that's already stuck there go away? Well, that's difficult to answer because this study doesn't give you that answer. In fact, we don't really know if catching up is possible or not from a physiological sensitivity. And then some of the stuff is what happens to people who are exercising, right? So you can't just look at sleep in isolation, but what happens if you increase the blood flow to the brain? Does that somehow, like a washing machine, kind of clean everything out because you're now filtering more stuff through it? These are all interesting questions, but here's what I want you to understand. First, if you deprive yourself of sleep, even if it's for one night, realize that sleep is one of the most important things you do. In fact, in self-principle, sleep is first. That's the S in self. It's very, very important, and most people don't talk about it. And when we talk about good sleep hygiene, just remember habits, right? People always talk about this, and I'll tell you, this is where I have some differences with some of my colleagues in nutrition. There's a lot of guys who are about the 17-day, 20-day, 21-day quick start. But for guys like me, what the evidence shows is everything is about creating habits. If you build habits, you will do the same thing without telling yourself a lot of energy to expend. Motivation is what people rely on when they do these quick starts, 17-day, 20-day, 14-day, whatever it is. Because motivation is a muscle, it fatigues. So what happens is you do great for 6 months on some new diet that you're starting, and then temptation sets in, and you fall off the wagon. But if you try to make small changes, build on it, set it up for success, you will do the same thing every night and it works. So for example, a good sleep regimen is make sure that you do the same thing every night. So if you're going to go to bed at 9 o'clock, right, at 8 o'clock, go take a shower. Now, here's where it becomes really important. You want to take a slightly warm shower, not hot, warm. Once you get done with the shower, you want to come into what kind of a room? Hot or cold? Cold. You want to come into a cold room. There's only 2 things you always want to do in your bed. There's only 2. One is sleep. The other one starts with an S. Okay? Other than that, you should not do anything else in your bed. If you sit there and watch TV, what you're essentially doing is activating the brain. And so even though people say, well, I watch TV and I fall asleep, the problem is the kind of sleep you get is not restful sleep. You're depriving the quality of your sleep by watching TV in the final couple of hours before you go to bed, especially if you have a hard time sleeping. Number 2, wake up at the same time every single day, including Saturday and Sunday. There's no such thing as weekends, guys. There isn't. Your body doesn't understand the concept of Saturday and Sunday. So if you want to wake up, I wake up at 4:30 every morning. That's my clock. So when I wake up, the first thing I do after I brush my teeth and do my usual stuff is I meditate for 10 minutes. Then I love this concept of eat the frog. and I don't literally eat the frog, but the concept is you do the most difficult task. So for me, right now, for example, I have 3 boards that I'm trying to maintain, and so I'm trying to study for my internal medicine boards because I let it lapse, and I was like, I'm doing so many lectures and nutrition work, and so now I'm trying to study for it, and I find no time. So the kids are asleep, I do my studying, then I go hit the gym, then I do my yoga, then I'm done and I go to work. But I wake up at the same time every single day. So if you want to improve your sleep habits, part of that sleep habits is waking up at the same time. Even if you're like, I'm so tired, I didn't sleep well last night, it doesn't matter. Wake up and get active. Because you're going to train your circadian rhythm to start becoming regular. And then optimal sleep is what? It's more than 8 hours. 8 hours or more. Official guidelines are what? 7 to 9 hours. But really, it's up to you. What the data shows is, for example, with beta amyloid, it's more than 8 hours. There are people who say, look, we function fine after 4 hours, but what are you risking? You're risking, long term, is it going to have an impact on things like memory? We still don't understand what causes dementia. We have all sorts of ideas. High blood pressure, diabetes, so forth and so on, chronic diseases, vascular diseases. Yet, we don't clearly understand what affects people. Some people get dementia, some don't. But what we do understand is that if you eat mostly plants, the closer you move this way, that if you move more, if you sleep more, and if you actually create social connections, you will find that you will have the best life possible. So that's the take home on the sleep stuff. Now let's get into the really fun stuff, because what's interesting about sugar is everywhere, right? And so a lot of times people will say, look, my doctor said because I'm a diabetic, I'm not allowed to eat fruits because they have sugar. So what's the data? Well, the data is very clear, and it says if you eat fruits, not fruit juice, because fruit juice is awful, but if you eat fruits, and if you want to juice, instead of juicing, blend, because you get this wonderful thing called fiber. So if you blend, or if you eat the fruits, we actually see that people's A1Cs, which is a measure of your sugars, A1Cs, or their fasting sugars, or their regular sugars, go down. If you eat fruits, your sugars go down, they don't go up. This becomes very important. Yet, if you eat fruit, or I guess you don't eat fruit juice, you drink fruit juice. So if you drink juice, your sugars go sky high. So you want to understand that difference, how remarkable fiber is for you. But now there's something else. Aside from sugar-sweetened beverages, there's artificial sweeteners. And the thing about artificial sweeteners is they come with the promise that if you don't like Coca-Cola, right, because you're worried about the empty calories, drink the Diet Coke, because somehow you don't have to feel guilty. So this really cracks me up, because I'll see people, they go through, or they get like a fast food meal, and they'll get like the double Whopper or whatever the heck it is, and 2 orders of French fries, and then please can I get a Diet Coke? Because somehow that Diet Coke is going to fix everything, right? It's not. Just like you can't walk off the donut you just ate. It doesn't make sense. The math just doesn't add up. So if you ate a bunch of junk food and you say, it's okay because I'm going to the gym, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't. Okay, so we know that with sugar stuff, if you eat a lot of sugar, you may have higher risk of stroke and dementia. We know about that. We know about saccharin and all of these other sweeteners that came out, that they may cause weight gain and obesity. We know that saccharin and aspartame are linked to a few very interesting things where you get impaired glucose tolerance, which basically means that when you eat sugar, it lasts in your blood for a long time. It has nowhere to go. So artificial sweeteners gives you resistance to insulin. That's fascinating. But what's really interesting is we know that we don't know a lot when it comes to looking at sugar and artificial sweeteners and dementia. So here's the study. So we're going to look at the data behind artificial sweeteners. But before I do, I want to take you on a quick journey to make you understand how powerful artificial sweeteners are. Because people talk about them, yet they don't realize why they're so addictive. I'll tell you why. So let's start with saccharin, right? It's been around forever. I mean, gosh, it's like, older than I am. 1879. Wow, who would have known, right? But here's the challenging part. I bet you didn't realize it's 200 to 700 times sweeter than sugar. Isn't that something? So what happens if you tell an alcoholic to go into a bar? Sooner or later, he or she is going to drink the alcohol. When you give somebody artificial sweeteners, they don't end somebody's craving for sugar. What do? They give you a high like no other. If I give you something that's 700 times sweeter than sugar, the next time you have sugar, are you going to want just 1 tablespoon or are you going to want 2 or maybe 3? Because you want to experience the same. Have you ever heard the saying that the heroin addict is always chasing their first high? The first high is what they chase for the rest of their life. That's the same thing here. All right, so saccharin is old, right? It's old news, 1879, who cares? Let's get into some new stuff. By the way, the controversy around cancer, so 1970s, there was some concern about cancer, right? So forth and so on. Then 2000, they came out, there's all this data, so they say, no, it's not linked to cancer. Do I know it's not linked to cancer? I don't know. But at the end of the day, what I do know is sooner or later, all of us are going to die of something. I don't care if we die, I care how we live. It's our quality that matters, and it's what kind of legacy we leave behind of our character. So this is important to understand that yes, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what I'm concerned about is the fact that it's so much sweeter than sugar. Aspartame, right? Equal. What's so cool about that? Well, it was discovered in 1965. So the good news is it was discovered before I was born. I just wanted to double check to make sure. I like to feel younger, so this is great news. I feel younger already, right? 200 times sweeter than sugar. And the thing is, we don't cook with it because it's not heat stable. But let's get into some other stuff. So here's another one, acesulfame. 1967, 200 times sweeter than sugar. Sucralose, everybody talks about Splenda, right? It's like Splenda is the new thing and stevia. Those are the two questions I always get about. So what's the deal with Splenda? 600 times. This is why when you put 1 packet of Splenda in your coffee or your tea or your water or whatever it is that you're putting it into, it's so much sweeter because it's 600 times, right? That's a lot. Neotame. This is really crazy, right? Neotame is like 13,000. Wow. Right? And guess what they put this in? All sorts of packaged foods. Right? So remember, what is the easiest way for me to get you guys, all of you in here, to eat cardboard? Add salt, sugar, and fat. If I eat salt, sugar, and fat plus flavorings to cardboard, you'll eat it. And so will your kids. It's fascinating. All right, let's do another one, because this one is crazy. It's 20,000 times, right? 20,000 times. And guess what they put this stuff in? It's very interesting. They put this stuff in packaged foods because it makes it taste sweet. So remember, what they do is they put salt and sugar together. So salt and sugar together plus some fat, and you will like those fast foods or whatever kind of food it is or the frozen foods because it will taste really good. So they used to say, salt receptors are only on one portion of the tongue and then you have sugar. That's not true. Salt, sugar, and fat receptors are all over your mouth. All over your mouth. Oh, and by the way, here's a good trivia question. You can next time, I don't know if you have a party, you can say, hey, that Sean guy gave me trivia questions. So here's a trivia question. How many days does it take to start changing your taste buds so that they can taste different? How many days do you think? 28? 3? 20? 24? 1? It's actually 7 days. 7. Okay, so nobody wins the trivia. I'm sorry. I'm sure somebody was meaning to say 7. Oh, you were. Very good. Awesome. You should buy a lottery ticket. That's a really good one. So, yes. So what's fascinating about it is we actually did the studies in Northern California, Kaiser Permanente, where the data shows that it actually takes about 7 days of, let's say you give up spicy food or you give up sugar, that normal food will start to taste sweeter. That's how interesting it is. 7 days is all it takes, right? So it's not that long of a time for you to start noticing a change by making a step. All right, stevia. Same thing, guys. If you're thinking stevia is natural, of course it's natural. So are mushrooms, and some of them will kill you. So just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe. Those are marketing terms, that it's natural, right? Just like the word organic. Anybody know what's so crazy about the term organic is? So when we talk about organic foods, right, what's the data shows is if you look at organic fruits and vegetables have higher quantities of antioxidants. They may have less pesticide residue on them. But what's crazy about foods is when you look at farmers, you'll see they'll have an area of land that's designated as organic. Then down here, just a little bit further away, it's non-organic. Now, what I've heard, this is just from the grapevine, that there's this invisible barrier. It's like goes up and down, right? And it prevents any bad mojo from crossing over. But what's interesting is this invisible barrier doesn't go into the soil, so the soil ends up being the same, which means all the chemicals that get washed from one area to the next and back and forth end up being the same. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that if you are blessed enough in your life that yes, you have the financial means to afford organic, go for it. And if you're somebody who says, look, money's a little bit tighter and I can't, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, because the difference is very little. So don't fall for the trap that just because something is organic, it's so much better. Just because it's stevia and it's a green packet, right? Just because it's green doesn't make it somehow better than if it's yellow or blue or orange. It's just green. And if you're colorblind, you wouldn't even know. All right, so let's take a look at this data. What did they look at? They basically, what they were doing was, Framingham Heart Study is a really long, ongoing data. So they started with about 5,000 volunteers. They looked at them about every 4 years. And what they did was they took a subset of these guys. So they had about 3,000 people they were going to look at. All of these guys are over 45 years of age. And the reason was because they wanted to have those guys that they could actually follow and see changes. Because if they picked somebody like 15 years old, they would have to wait a really long time, right? So then they also had people they were looking for dementia as well. Okay, so what did they want to make sure they excluded? Well, if you already had neurological disease, they did not want to include you, because then we don't know if there was some other stuff that might have caused it. So these are all people who don't have any sort of neurological disease going on, whether it was dementia intake or stroke-wise. All right. Then what they did was they basically gave these guys food frequency questionnaires. Now, most people like myself hate this because it asks people, what did you have to eat yesterday? And I can't remember, right? And I'm like, oh my God, this is like some really nice person and I don't want to let them down. So maybe they think that, I had 2 pieces of broccoli instead of 1, so I'll just write 2, right? So food frequency questionnaires can be messed up and can have errors quite easily. So you want to know that. Yet, if you follow these people and you ask enough of them, you're able to get a much better understanding. Can the system be fooled? Yes. So you always want to ask, did they use a food frequency questionnaire? And if they did, how many times did they use it? All right, so that being said, they looked at them, they repeated a bunch of times to see what would happen. Okay, so let's go on. So the other thing that's always really important is when they divide people into different groups, you want to make sure that the data, the outcome, is not because the groups were so different. Because if the groups were different, it may not be something that you're comparing, it may be something very different. So in this particular case, there's a lot of data. You don't want to read this because it's really, really small. Just realize that there's some pink color on this chalkboard over here, right? That's all you want to see is this pink over there, that's it. But there was no difference as far as the number of people in each of these categories, except for the fact that the number of people who had 2 or more artificial sweetened drinks per day was very little. Why should you care about that in this study? Because what it's telling you is this may not represent the typical American out there. Typical American out there has a lot of artificial sweetened drinks per day, not just 1 or 2. Important to remember as we look at this data. Okay, BMI was fine, it wasn't a big difference, but here's what's really interesting. The people who had the most amount of artificial sweetened drinks per day, right, they actually had the highest number of calories. They had about 2,200. But the people who had less than 1 artificial sweetened drink per day, they only had 1,600 calories. Why am I telling you this? Because this is going to affect the results. And you should care because maybe when I get to the results, it has nothing to do with artificial sweeteners. Maybe it has to do with the fact that the people who were more health conscious, who slept more, moved more, created more social relationships, right? Who ate mostly plants, also drank less artificial sweetened beverages. So whenever somebody gets up here and just gives you the results of a study, remember, it's far more important to ask the difficult questions. Okay, so what did they find? They found that if you were actually somebody who was getting about 0 to 6 artificial sweetened drinks per week, your risk of having stroke went up by 109%. 0 to 6, right? And so if you're wondering, what's the safe limit? Well, their safe limit was 0, right? So if you went above 0, to up to 6, it was 209%. For ischemic stroke was a whopping 247%. Even when they looked at it by sort of down here, excluding for all sorts of adjusting for all sorts of different variables, it was still incredibly high, 162%. Now, you don't have to get fascinated by all of this data, but what you want to take home with you is that basically when you went above 0, your risk started going up. So if you're thinking about artificial sweetened beverages, whether it's your diet sodas or anything else, I have a very simple advice for you. Please put the drink down. That's it. Very simple. Okay. So with that, that's what I want you to understand as far as this goes. Same thing goes when they started looking at dementia. If you went more than 1 a day, more than 1 artificial sweetened drink per day, once again, your risk went up by 220%. 120%. But 120% is a lot. So when you start to say, if I get older, and this is just me personally, the most important thing that's needed for my life is to make sure that this is good. So quality over quantity. I don't want to live to be 200 if I don't even know who I am. I'd rather live a good life and have this intact. So artificial sweeteners, we don't know if there's a direct link or an indirect link, but the data is pretty startling. And by the way, this is the only study we have on artificial sweeteners. The only one so far. So do you want to wait for the next 10 years before we get you some more data to say, yes, it was bad for you? Right? So just FYI, kind of keep that in mind. Okay. So then the other thing that was interesting, so this is a different way of looking at the same data. What they're doing here is they're looking at event-free survival. So basically, what they want to see is this one right here. They want to see how many people stay as close to this as possible. That's event-free survival. Every time one of them has a stroke, the number drops. So you can see if you had more than 1 artificial sweetened beverage per day, you had the fastest decline. right? You had the fastest decline when it came to your risk for having a stroke. Same thing for dementia. What's the lowest? People who had more than one drink per day. But I want you to caution yourself to just remember, just because this is just looking at artificial sweetened beverages doesn't mean that if you enjoy your stevia or Splenda that you can never have it. Because everything comes together in nutrition. There's no one single thing that's absolutely evil. It's when you mix all of the right bad things together that it becomes really bad. So if you're exercising, if you're eating really good food, if you're creating those social connections, and if you're focusing on sleep, and every once in a while you do this, you don't have to worry. But if you're sitting there all the time, you're smoking, you're drinking, and you're doing this, then it matters. And I brought up drinking, so I might as well tell you, is there a safe limit to drinking alcohol? Right? There's all sorts of guidelines. So is there a safe drinking limit? And it turns out when it comes to brain decline, the answer is no. You're over decades, for people who drink any amount from 0 moving up, the more you drink, the worse you do on test of memory. Just the way it is. And which country in the world, I was going to say which country in America, that doesn't make any sense. Which country in the world has the loosest, of the most relaxed standards around alcohol intake? Us, right? It's funny because everybody looks at the same research, yet United States has some of the most relaxed standards. So the official nutritional guidelines on what's considered to be okay for drinking alcohol are incredibly relaxed. In fact, UK changed their guidelines and made them a lot stricter. So for UK, for example, it's 1 drink, a glass of wine a day is what they're saying. For us, it's like 2 glasses or 2 drinks. It's almost double. Very interesting. And why is that? Because of the fact that there's so much pressure, there's so much lobbying going on by the alcohol beverage industry into what's considered to be guidelines. All right. So limitations, we talked about a little bit. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that as you increase your consumption of artificial sweetened beverages, or it doesn't matter if it's in food or cakes or whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter. Once you start increasing them, there is a potential risk of it affecting things like Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, etc. So what's the advice? The advice is cut it down. If you can't go to 0, that's okay. Reduce it. Reduce it. All right, let's look at another one. This one, let's take a look at things like mortality and stroke and what happens in heart disease. So same exact thing. We know some data around heart disease, and what we know is that if you increase sugar-sweetened beverages or artificially sweetened beverages, your risk of heart disease, stroke, dementia, all of that goes up. So if we know that, what do we know about all of this stuff and what can we do differently? But nutrition is such an ugly science because you will have one study that comes out and says it's bad for you, and then you have like the nurse's health study that says, guess what? There's no association. And these are the kind of things in the media that confuse people. So why should you care? Because if you took a bunch of people that were very healthy and doing all of those other things we talked about, they may not show an impact of one bad thing. Does that make sense? If you're doing a bunch of good things and you do one bad thing, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Depends on what that bad thing is. I'm only talking about food. It's only about food. So when it comes to food, if you make that one mistake, it's okay, right? It's okay. All right. So in this one, it was looking at women's health study. It's an observational study. It's lots of different places, so we like that because the more centers we use, the more different ethnic groups, different ages, different types of people, different lifestyles we get, right? It's postmenopausal women, 50 to 79, so they're very young as far as the age is concerned, so we can get some really good data. And it's a lot of follow-up. They followed them for almost 12 years. So we should be able to get some good idea of what happens here. All right, so what happens here? First, what you see here is that most of them were young, the majority of them were Caucasian, so this may not necessarily apply to you if you were Asian. They were younger, they were highly educated, they made more money, yet somehow because they made more money, they were also overweight or obese, they exercised less, they had lower diet quality. Maybe they were working so much that they just sat around all day and read articles. All right, and they actually had more calorie consumption. So, what's interesting? Fatal and non-fatal stroke. The more artificial sweetened beverages you had, your stroke went up, just like the other study. Ischemic stroke went up. Heart disease, 29% increase based on artificial sweeteners. All-cause mortality, your risk of dying from anything. You know, all-cause means dying of anything, including if you walk outside and get struck by lightning, it's because of the artificial sweeteners. I'm just checking, making sure you're awake. That's all it is. Good. All right. So, what's the data? Basically, what's interesting about all this stuff is when they looked at different subsets, what they found was the more your artificial sweeteners intake went, the higher your risk was. So if your BMI, which is body mass index, was higher, you had 103% higher risk for ischemic stroke. These are all numbers flying around, right? Your all-cause mortality, if you had a lower BMI, was up by 24%. And for African Americans, and why does this matter? Because if you are of an African American descent, for me as a kidney specialist, what we know is, in terms of the risk of progression to end-stage renal disease or dialysis, it's 2.5 times higher in African Americans than it is in Caucasians. It's 1.5 times higher in Hispanics than it is in Caucasians. Every single ethnic group has higher propensity for some disease. There's no ethnic group that gets spared. But you want to understand the risk, and if you know the risk, you want to be even more careful. So there were a few limitations, right? It's correlation study, it's not a causation study. What causes it first? Is it because of the artificial sweeteners or something else that's going on? We don't really know as far as that goes. There's self-reported data. Some people may not be saying, hey, I eat a lot of sugars because I feel bad, or I had the Splenda earlier today because I don't want the researcher to think that I'm a bad person. So people oftentimes underreport. But what you want to take home from this is very simple. If you think that artificial sweetened beverages are safe, the answer is no. The data is very clear. If you drink a lot of artificial sweetened beverages, you will gain weight, guaranteed. This is not something of, we haven't quite figured it out yet. No, it's guaranteed. When we have animal models and we give them sugary drinks versus like Splenda drinks, they will eat more of their chow if they're given the artificial sweetened stuff. And that's the same thing with people. So when you have your fast food meal and you get that diet drink, the diet drink unfortunately triggers the pleasure centers without giving you the satiety, the fullness. As a result of it, you end up eating more of it. So be very, very careful about all of the marketing behind zero-calorie flavorings for your water. There's so many of my patients who say they hate water. And I respond to them by saying, you hate living? Right? Because obviously if you want to live, you got to drink water. Oh no, I can't stand plain water. Well, that's because you have programmed yourself to like what? Artificially sweetened beverages. The taste, the sweet taste. We love sugary taste. By the way, that's my wife. That's my two beautiful daughters. I want to open it up for any questions you guys want to ask about any topic, whether it's sleep, whether it's sugar-sweetened beverages, or anything you want to know about exercise, nutrition, any topic is good. And you let me know how you guys want me to, I can go column by column, or whoever you guys give the mic to, whatever you guys prefer.
We are plant-based, but my husband does a lot of protein shakes that are sweet, vanilla, and it's plant-based protein, but what is
okay. Okay, so is your husband here? Okay, good. So I can talk about him all day. So, what is okay. So when it comes to protein powders, what they've found is that the protein powders that have the highest level of lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, and heavy metal contamination essentially is actually plant-based protein powders. So remember, food is awesome. Plant-based protein powders suck. Okay? Don't do it. So, and this is where, like, look, because I'm not represented by any stuff, I have nothing to sell. I just tell you what the research shows, right? And so when you ask me a question, you're going to get the brutal and honest truth and nothing but the truth, but it's going to offend some people. And I give talks all across the country, and I'll have an audience of 1,500, and I'll have big banners that say they're sponsored by X and X and X. I'm like, oh God, I'm going to get shot when I walk out. So just so you know, the answer is it turns out that egg protein actually has the lowest amount of contaminants. So that's egg white protein powder, and then it's whey, and then it's plants. And the reason for it is the other thing you want to remember, this is for all three categories. When they extract protein from whether it's plants or it's eggs or it's whey, etc., the issue that you run into is what they use. And a lot of places still use stuff like hexane, which is a known carcinogen. So the extraction process is also very important to know. And that's why you don't need protein powders. Contrary to every single popular belief out there, you don't need it, right? You know what's the best protein powder on there? I don't know, but I think beans are awesome, right? So you can just have beans and do awesome with it. And that's why, there's a movie out, it's called Game Changers, and I'll just put a plug in it because I really enjoyed it. And I tell you, there's like so much advertisement for beans. So if there was a stock in beans, I would be like all over it. So that's it.
Is there a difference between day sleep and night sleep, having been a night nurse for many years?
So it's really interesting. I get asked this question by my colleagues, especially my OB-GYN colleagues who do a lot of night call and so forth. Unfortunately, the issue is you have a circadian rhythm. What's fascinating is your gut microbiome also has a circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm is based on the light we receive. And that's why if you go in and get like a 5,000 Kelvin light bulb, it's really bad for you because it screws up your melatonin secretion. But at the end of the day, it's based on when your body senses light and when it senses dark. That's what it is. So what you want to do is the closer you can create a rhythm to that, the easier. I haven't found a solution for people who do a lot of nights. I just don't have one. It's not to say that, it's impossible. We do have data that it shows it does take a lot of years off your life if you do a lot of night work in general. You guys point, I will make sure I answer whatever questions you guys have. I am at your beck and call.
What are your thoughts of the use of melatonin for sleep?
Yeah, great question. So what ends up happening to most people is first of all, the melatonin dosing out there is actually very high. So you don't need milligram dosing. You actually need microgram dosing because that's what your melatonin normally produces. So if you start to take exogenous melatonin or basically over-the-counter melatonin, you're going to shut down your own melatonin production. So it will make it much harder for you to get sleep without the melatonin. So how many people, and you don't have to raise your hand because we don't want to point fingers, but I bet you there's some people in here who started with 1 milligram, went to 3 milligrams, went to 5 milligrams, went to 10 milligrams, and they're like, gosh, melatonin does nothing for me. And that's because it's habit forming. It's the same thing with laxatives, right? For you people who are a little bit older, or I say wiser, if you're wiser and you take laxatives, your bowels get used to it and then they stop working. So if you're going to take melatonin, remember, try not to take it every day. Try to take the smallest dosing you can find that helps you out. Because if you take it every day, you're going to start to affect your own production.
What about erythritol?
Yeah, so erythritol is a sugar alcohol. And we don't have any data to say, does it do bad or good? I will tell you the same issue applies to sugar alcohols as it does to this, which is the risk of insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, risk of weight gain, all of those things apply. And of course, sugar alcohols upset your stomach, so a lot of people have diarrhea. So a lot of patients I've had who've had all of these GI workups, and it turns out they just chew gum a lot. You stop their gum, you stop their diarrhea. So just remember, sugar alcohol can really do a number on your belly, but as far as dementia goes, I don't have any data. When the data comes out, I could share it for you, but right now, don't know. Where would you like me to go next? Okay.
I'm in remission, and it's been a 2-year battle. 1 year I was not vegan, the second year I was. And during that battle, I got really sick. So when I was not vegan, I could have like chicken soup and, what is when you're not feeling well and you're not able to really do much cooking, what's the perfect food? I relied a lot the second go round on sweet potatoes, and Gwen cooked a lot for me. But so sweet potatoes, soybeans, beans and rice. I mean, what's a go-to for somebody that's sick and nutritionally?
So it's a difficult question to answer, partly because there isn't any right answer per se as far as that goes. I'll tell you, when you look at places like the Blue Zone, it's not like they never eat meat. And this is where people get confused, is if you look at Okinawa, Japan, for example, they'll eat meat, but they'll eat it once or twice a month, versus Americans eat meat once or twice a day. That's the big difference when we talk about stuff. So remember when we said, even if you slip and fall, you do something that's not good, the fact that you do everything else that's right so much, it makes up for some of those things that we do. So as far as that goes, I don't have a good answer. I can tell you as far as tofu goes and as far as soy products goes, they are awesome. And in fact, so for my 2 little girls, one is 6, one is 2, after the first year, we started them on unsweetened soy milk, because I think soy is awesome. It used to be called soy milk. Now it's called soy beverage because of the dairy industry fighting against them. But the long answer to that is really no. I mean, as long as you eat a variety of foods, this is where colors matter. If you're having brown rice, right, so you're having your legumes, you're having your lentils in there, you're having your beans, you're having your vegetables, your fruits. If you get that variety in, it's all good. And if you're not hungry, and let's say that, you want to have protein shakes, go for it. Go for it. Just remember, at the end of the day, it's not a single thing that's going to be terrible for you. If you combine things, if you make sure you focus on your sleep hygiene, it's very important. You make sure you walk every single day, right? You want to walk for about 45 minutes to an hour. It really makes a difference. It's not 30 minutes. 30 minutes is total crap, right? And it's funny because if you look at the blue zones, in general, the people there, they walk on average 5 to 10 miles every single day. They just don't know it, but they do. Right? I feel bad for the researchers who had to follow them to figure that out, right? And work on those social connections. Just the fact that you guys are here tonight, you know how much it does for your insides? Just the fact that you're sitting down, you're part of this amazing group. Your hearts are open, you're taking this information in. You are kind. I saw you guys walking in and you had smiles on your face. That's so different from the average person out there. So you're already doing so much for yourself. So don't worry about the specifics, right? I will tell you, food shaming is real. And it's a very real phenomenon where we judge people on what's on their plate. Let's stop judging. There's no reason to judge. What we can do instead is we can help be kind to each other. So don't forget the other portions of self along with the food.
I think we'll take this as the last question, but thank you so much.
Thank you. I just wondered if you had any suggestions for someone who falls asleep with no problem, but can't stay asleep. So about 4 or 5 hours in, I'm awake and I don't feel like I can go back to sleep.
So the reason people have a difficult time staying asleep is because there's and I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist, but I am somebody who also struggles with that. The issue that comes up is there's a lot of stuff that we have during the daytime we haven't thought about and resolved. And one of the best ways to do this is to try to focus and meditate. You know, the whole idea of meditation is very simple. Meditation comes in very different forms. For some people, a form of meditation is coming to church. When you sit there and you open your heart and your mind, you may not realize it, but you actually slow things down. You get rid of all of these things and you realize they're not as important as I thought they were. For other people, they have to sit in silence and they have to meditate. Whatever that form is that you need, if you do that, you're going to find that if you resolve it during the day, it will not keep you up at night. In fact, I'll tell you a personal story of mine is, you know, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about nutrition is my wife is very ill right now and she has lupus and she has liver cirrhosis. And, you know, both her and I, we eat really healthy. We practice everything that I talk about. I do so much research into nutrition. So one of the things that I always get concerned is we talk a lot about, you know, how certain things we can fix them. There are certain things in life we can't fix. And one of the hardest lessons in life is learning to accept what we cannot fix. And so I know that in here sometimes we talk about disease reversal. Well, there are certain diseases we cannot reverse. And you know, even though that's the case, that's okay. We can make the most of the time we have with people. So what I would recommend is find that thing during the daytime that helps you to release.